I never imagined Thanksgiving would become the turning point of my entire life. But looking back now, everything that happened makes a strange kind of sense, as if the pressure that had been building for years finally ran out of places to hide. When I drove from Boise to my parents' home that cold November morning, I wasn't expecting anything except an uncomfortable dinner, shallow conversations, and the familiar heaviness of pretending everything was normal. Thanksgiving in our family always felt like a performance. We smiled, we prayed, we talked about blessings, but deep down we all knew we were trying to hold together something that had been cracking for years. I just hoped this year would be quieter than the last because the last one had ended with my marriage collapsing and everyone pretending it wasn't happening. The drive itself was quiet. The sky was heavy and gray, the kind of winter sky that looked like a lid placed over the world. The highway was almost empty, the landscape a blur of brown fields and patches of frost. I kept the radio off so I wouldn't have to think about what kind of mood to force myself into when I arrived. My family hadn't seen me much in the past year. I'd been avoiding almost everyone from my old life, especially anyone connected to the church. The collapse of my temple marriage had left me full of guilt and confusion. And even though I knew logically that divorces happened everywhere, in the Mormon world it always felt like a personal failure, almost like a public scar you can't hide. I hadn't talked much about it since the separation. People said things like, "We're praying for you," or "Stay close to the covenants," and every conversation made me feel smaller. My bishop, Bishop Carter, had been trying to meet with me for months, leaving messages and saying he was concerned. Concerned was always a word that made me feel worse. Concerned meant someone thought something was wrong with you that needed fixing. Concerned was another way of saying disappointed. As I pulled into my parents' driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, letting the engine idle. Their house looked the same. White siding, narrow porch, the American flag hanging even in November. The small pine tree my mom decorated every Christmas, already wrapped with lights she hadn't turned on yet. I could see shadows moving inside. They were already preparing dinner, already in motion. I inhaled and stepped out. My mother came to the door as soon as she saw me. She wrapped me in a tight hug, too tight, the kind that tries to convince you everything is fine even when nothing feels right. She smelled like cinnamon and hand soap. "You made it," she said, her voice bright in that way she used when she wanted to hide her anxiety. My father emerged from the kitchen a moment later, wiping his hands on a towel. "Hey, son," he said softly, as if speaking too loud might break something. His voice had become quieter in recent years, more withdrawn. He used to be the one who spoke confidently in church, bearing testimony, giving lessons, always steady. But something in him had dimmed, though none of us talked about it. My younger sister, Emily, gave me a small wave from the table where she was cutting sweet potatoes. She didn't know how to talk to me anymore either. My older brother Jacob offered a nod without looking up from his phone. The whole house felt like a room full of people trying not to say the obvious. We started preparing to eat. The turkey was already in the oven, the rolls rising under a kitchen towel, the mashed potatoes nearly done. For a while, things felt almost normal. We talked about small things: the weather, my job, Emily's college classes, Jacob's new promotion. Nothing deep, nothing real, nothing risky. That was the unofficial rule in our family. Never touch the fault lines. Then dinner began. The table looked perfect, just like every year. My mother always made sure Thanksgiving looked like something out of a magazine, as if a beautiful tablecloth and well-arranged silverware could hold together whatever we were afraid to say. Halfway through dinner, the atmosphere warmed slightly. My mother laughed at something Jacob said. My sister teased me about how I always took too much cranberry sauce. For a moment, I thought maybe this year would pass quietly. Maybe we could pretend long enough to get through dessert. Then came the knock. It wasn't a gentle knock. It was firm, loud, deliberate. Everyone froze. My mother looked at the door as if she expected a stranger selling something. My father frowned, confused. No one visited on Thanksgiving. We weren't that kind of family. I stood up, unsure why, and walked to the door. As soon as I opened it, my stomach dropped. There he was, Bishop Carter, smiling like this was the most natural thing in the world. He held a pumpkin pie in his hands, the store-bought kind with the plastic cover still attached. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his eyes lit up with that familiar brightness he used whenever he believed he was following inspiration. "Happy Thanksgiving," he said cheerfully. "I hope this isn't a bad time. I just felt prompted to stop by." Prompted. The word made my shoulders tense immediately. Before I could respond, my mother appeared behind me and gasped in delight. "Bishop, what a wonderful surprise. Please come in." I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him this wasn't okay, that he couldn't just show up like this. But my mother was already ushering him inside, removing his coat, thanking him for the pie, pulling out another chair at the table as if she had been waiting for royalty. My father stiffened, his lips pressed tightly together. My siblings exchanged a glance heavy with discomfort, but no one said anything. We all sat back down, now with the bishop at the head of the table as if he belonged there. He began speaking immediately, asking about the food, praising my mother's cooking, making polite jokes. But underneath the friendliness, there was a clear sense that he wasn't just here for dinner. Eventually he turned to me. "We've missed you at church," he said warmly, but with an undeniable weight behind the words. I nodded politely. "I've been busy." He smiled in that patient way that suggested he knew more than I was saying. "I've been praying for your spiritual renewal," he continued. "Trials can be blessings if handled with obedience." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. My mother looked uncomfortable but proud he was talking about spiritual matters. My father stared at his plate. My siblings stopped eating altogether. Then the bishop shifted the conversation again, this time closer to the thing I feared most. He talked about the challenges of covenant keeping, his eyes landing on me. He mentioned the strained divorce places on the soul. He said very gently, "Your family must be worried." My heart pounded. My mother inhaled sharply. Jacob looked at me with wide eyes. Emily stared down at her plate as if she wanted to disappear. I wanted to shut him down, but this wasn't my house. This was my parents' home, a place where church leaders were treated like emissaries of God. I had no room to push back. Then he went further. He began sharing private things I had told him in confidence months before the divorce. My guilt, my questions about doctrine, my difficulty renewing my temple recommend, the doubts I hadn't spoken aloud to anyone except him. "Your family deserves to know where your heart stands," he said. I felt heat rising in my face, anger mixed with humiliation. My mother looked devastated, as if hearing these things out loud somehow confirmed her worst fears. My sister looked at me with sympathy, struggling to understand why he was exposing so much. My father's jaw tightened, his shoulders rigid. Something inside me cracked. I wasn't just hurt, I was stripped bare. This wasn't spiritual guidance. This was a public display of spiritual authority, and I was the example. I looked around the table. My family looked trapped. My mother's hands shook slightly. My sister blinked back tears. Jacob stared angrily at his plate. My father's eyes were somewhere distant, darkened by a heaviness I'd never recognized before. And then something unexpected happened. My father quietly set down his fork. He looked directly at the bishop, and he said in a low, steady voice I hadn't heard in years, "Enough." The word hung in the air like a crack of thunder. The bishop blinked, stunned by the interruption. My mother whispered, "Please, let's just stay peaceful." But my father straightened his back and repeated himself, louder this time. I said enough. It was the first time in my life I had seen him challenge a church leader. The bishop tried to recover. "Brother Anderson, I assure you I'm only here because—" My father raised a hand. "If we're going to talk about truth tonight," he said slowly, "then I have something to say too." Everyone stared at him. Even the bishop leaned back, thrown off balance. My father exhaled shakily as if preparing to tear open something he had kept buried for decades. And then he said the words that would change everything. "I haven't believed in the church for a long time." The room went silent. My mother's eyes widened in horror. Emily covered her mouth. Jacob froze, stunned. I felt my entire chest tighten at once, a mix of shock, confusion, and something else. Something like recognition. My father continued, his voice breaking. I stayed for the family. I stayed because I didn't want us to be judged. But I haven't believed in years. And I can't sit here and watch you shame my son. The bishop's face went pale. My father explained everything. How he had deep doubts for years. How he disagreed with doctrines he never dared mention. How he felt trapped by expectations. How he went through the motions to protect us from gossip and scrutiny. He confessed that he stayed silent because he thought vulnerability wasn't allowed. Because doubt was treated as contagion. Because he believed losing his faith would break the family. But keeping the secret had broken him slowly instead. My mother cried softly, torn between her faith and her husband's confession. My siblings stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, and I felt an overwhelming wave of connection, like the missing puzzle piece of my own crisis had just been revealed. Everything I struggled with, everything I feared, everything I internalized, I had inherited from him without ever knowing. The bishop tried to interrupt, but my father wouldn't let him. You had no right to expose him here, my father said, voice steady despite trembling hands. This was not your place. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father not as a man shaped by the church, but as a man breaking free from it. When he finally fell silent, the room felt transformed. The bishop no longer controlled the space. The authority he carried dissolved into the air like smoke. My mother wiped her tears. Jacob stared at the bishop with anger. Emily looked at me, silently apologizing for never understanding my suffering. I felt raw, exposed, but strangely lighter, as if my father's truth had made room for my own. And then the bishop, still rattled, said quietly, I think we should speak privately. No, I said firmly, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. Not tonight. He stared at me, stunned. My father nodded as if giving me permission I didn't know I needed. The bishop looked around at the family he had unintentionally unraveled. The perfect Thanksgiving image had shattered, revealing everything underneath. Decades of silence, pressure, fear, guilt, expectations, and the truth we had all been avoiding. And that's when everything truly began to unravel. The bishop's face shifted as if he wasn't sure whether he should defend himself, apologize, or try to reassert authority. But something had changed in the room. The power he carried when he first walked through the door was gone. He seemed smaller now, unsure, almost out of place. My father remained still, calm in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if telling the truth had finally allowed him to breathe for the first time in decades. My mother leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. She wasn't crying anymore, but the shock hadn't faded from her expression. For as long as I could remember, she had relied on the church as the framework that kept her world stable, predictable, safe. Hearing her husband admit that he had been silently carrying doubts for years was like watching the ground shift beneath her feet. Jacob set down his fork slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes moving between our father and the bishop. Emily wiped her eyes and stared at her plate, trying to absorb everything, but her breathing was uneven, and I could tell the weight of the moment was pressing down on her. I felt caught in a strange mixture of pain, relief, and disbelief. Learning that my father had gone through his own silent crisis of faith made me realize just how much none of us really knew each other. Not fully, not honestly. For years we'd been living behind the polished smiles and church lessons, keeping our inner worlds hidden from each other out of fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of disappointing one another. Fear that the truth would break the family apart. But the truth was doing something else entirely. It was breaking something open, not apart. My father turned to me, his eyes heavy with years of unspoken emotion. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I didn't know how." I swallowed hard. My voice shook when I spoke. I didn't know how either. The bishop shifted uncomfortably in his chair and cleared his throat. "I think there's been a misunderstanding tonight," he began. But my father cut him off again. "No," my father said firmly. "There hasn't been a misunderstanding. There's been a pattern, one that has caused hurt in this family for years. The bishop straightened slightly, his hands clasped together. "I came here with love," he said, his tone tense but trying to sound calm. "I came because I care about your son." My father's voice was steady. "You came because you thought you had the right to involve yourself in something deeply personal. You came because you believe your calling gives you authority over our family dynamics. But you overstepped." The bishop opened his mouth as if to protest, but something in my father's expression must have stopped him, because he closed it again. My mother rubbed her temples, overwhelmed. "David," she whispered to my father, "why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you keep this to yourself?" My father hesitated, then spoke with a quiet vulnerability I had never seen from him. "Because I didn't want to lose you," he said. "Or the kids. I didn't want you to think less of me. I thought if I kept going through the motions, maybe the doubts would fade. But they didn't. They just grew." My mother looked at him with a mixture of hurt and compassion. "I wish you had trusted me," she whispered. "I didn't know how," he admitted. "We were all so busy trying to be perfect that I didn't know how to be honest." A long silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence filled with revelations that couldn't be undone. Finally, the bishop stood up, smoothing down his tie. "I think I should leave," he said quietly. It was the first time he sounded unsure of himself, the first time he didn't seem fully in control. He looked at me and said, "We can talk later, when emotions have settled." I didn't answer. My father didn't either. The bishop hesitated at the door, waiting for someone to say something, but no one did. He finally let himself out, closing the door gently behind him. The sound echoed through the house like the closing of a chapter none of us had planned to open. After the door clicked shut, nobody spoke for a long time. It felt like the air itself had shifted, like we were all adjusting to the realization that the foundation we had built our family on was more fragile than we ever admitted. My mother finally broke the silence. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I don't know how to process all of this." Emily reached out and touched her hand. "Maybe we don't have to figure it all out tonight," she said softly. "Maybe tonight is just the beginning." Jacob leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "I always felt like I couldn't talk about how much pressure I felt," he said. "Like I had to be this perfect example. I didn't know Dad felt that way too." My father looked at me. "I saw you pulling away last year," he said softly. "I saw you struggling, and I wanted to help you. But I was afraid that if I admitted how much I questioned things, it would make things worse." A deep ache formed in my chest. "I thought I was alone," I said. "I thought I was the only one who didn't fit anymore." My father shook his head slowly. "You were never alone," he said. "We just didn't know how to say it." My mother wiped her cheeks and looked at me with eyes full of worry. "I don't want to lose my family," she said. "I don't care what anyone believes or doesn't believe. I just want us to stay together." Her voice cracked, and for the first time that night I saw her not as the guardian of our family's spiritual appearance, but as a woman afraid of losing the people she loved most. Emily leaned toward her. "We're still here," she said softly. "Nothing about tonight changes that." Jacob added, "Honestly, pretending everything was fine was exhausting. Maybe talking about this stuff is what keeps us together." We all fell into a quiet, fragile understanding. It wasn't resolution, but it was truth. And truth, even when messy, felt more stable than the facade we'd been maintaining for decades. My father looked at me again, hesitant. "Can I ask, how long have you been struggling?" "Really struggling?" I took a deep breath. "Since before the divorce," I said. "I felt so much pressure to make the marriage work because it was a temple marriage. When things fell apart between us, I felt like I had failed on a spiritual level, not just a personal one." Emily's eyes softened. "You never failed," she said. "You were hurting." I continued, the words finally pouring out after being bottled up for so long. "After the separation, I felt watched, judged, like every step I took was being monitored. I couldn't go to church without feeling like everyone knew my relationship had fallen apart because I wasn't righteous enough, and talking to the bishop only made it worse. I felt like I was being interrogated. Like every doubt I had was a weakness he needed to correct. Jacob frowned. "That's messed up," he said. "You should never have been put through that." My father nodded. "Leaders forget that they're just people," he said. "They forget how much their words can wound someone who's already vulnerable." My mother twisted a napkin in her hands. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought you were distancing yourself because you were angry with us." "I wasn't angry," I said gently. "I was tired. And ashamed. And scared that if I said anything real you'd be disappointed." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I've been many things," she said softly. "But I've never been disappointed in your heart. You're a good man. You always have been." Something inside me loosened, something I'd been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it had become. Hearing that from her didn't fix everything, but it opened a door. We spent hours talking after that. Real talking. Honest talking. The kind we'd never allowed ourselves before. My father shared stories of his own crisis. Nights he had stayed awake reading, questioning, praying but feeling nothing. Times when he wanted to walk away but stayed because he thought it was his duty. Times when he wanted to tell my mother the truth but didn't because he feared it would rip the family apart. My mother admitted she had sensed something in him but was too afraid to ask. "I didn't want to know," she said quietly. If I knew, it made it real, and I wasn't ready to face that. Emily talked about the pressure she felt being the youngest, always needing to be the optimistic one, the one who made everyone smile. "I felt like if I ever showed doubt, I'd disappoint all of you," she said. Jacob confessed that he'd been struggling with his own questions about faith but buried them because he was afraid of judgment. Each admission chipped away at the invisible walls we'd built around ourselves. Each truth made the room feel lighter, as if the air finally had space to move. By the time the conversation finally wound down, the food on the table was cold. The candles had burned low. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the faint wind outside. We were exhausted, emotionally drained, but strangely connected in a way we hadn't been in years. As I looked at my family, sitting around a table that had once felt like a stage for perfection, I realized something important. Pain doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it reveals. Sometimes it breaks open the things we've been too afraid to confront. Sometimes it forces us to face the truth we've been avoiding, even when that truth is uncomfortable. In the weeks that followed, things didn't magically fix themselves, but they changed. My father and I talked more than we ever had in my adult life. He told me he felt lighter now that he wasn't hiding. My mother started asking real questions about belief, about doubt, about whether faith meant pretending or searching. Emily and Jacob became more open about their own feelings, their own questions. As for me, I felt myself finally begin to breathe again. I stopped pretending. I set boundaries. I allowed myself to rebuild my identity outside of expectations. I started therapy, something I should have done years earlier but didn't because I thought it meant I wasn't strong enough. A month later, I heard through a friend that Bishop Carter had been released from his calling. Several families had complained about him overstepping boundaries, getting too involved, disclosing too much personal information. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part felt sadness. Not for him, but for the system that encouraged leaders to believe they had authority over people's inner lives. I never spoke to him again. And yet, sometimes, when I think back to that night, I realize something unexpected. Everything that happened, the humiliation, the confrontation, the confessions, the unraveling, became the catalyst we needed. It forced us to stop living behind the facade. It made us face the truth, even when it hurt. And it taught me something I didn't understand back then but see clearly now. Life tends to amplify the lessons we refuse to learn. Patterns repeat until we confront them. What we suppress eventually rises, and sometimes the most disruptive moments become the ones that finally set us free. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Stories like this help more people than you realize. And if you want to support this work, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description and in the pinned comment. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being here.